In our last study of Esther, we found Haman exalted to a position second to the king, requiring all men to bow down and give him reverence. Mordecai wouldn't do so, therefore Haman hated him. And then when Haman found out that he was a Jew, Haman hated all of Mordecai's people. He went into the king and deceived the king into making a decree that would destroy all of the Jews. And we left off, I would like to read the last verse, verse 15 of chapter 3. It says, "The post went out," this was the king's decree, "being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Shushan was perplexed." There's this contrast between what's taking place with Haman and the king and the news that is spreading throughout the land, throughout the empire, as Jewish people hear that they are going to be destroyed. We pick up in our study in chapter 4. I would like to just read through the chapter, maybe touching on a few things, but then honing in on a handful of things that I believe the Lord has put on my heart for us to discuss. Starting in verse 1. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. We see Mordecai, and he is mourning. He is mourning over what has transpired. He understands the threat for himself, for Esther, and for all of his people scattered throughout the empire. And his response was to mourn. He's there weeping and wailing and wondering about what has transpired. Tonight, many like Mordecai are weeping and wailing and wondering. And the Bible tells us in Romans 12:15 that we should weep with those that weep and mourn with those that mourn. We should be like our Lord, who is that great high priest that we read about in Hebrews, who can be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. Like Jesus there before raising Lazarus, listening to those weep and mourn, those who are heartbroken over their loss, and Jesus wept. Mordecai is in mourning. And verse 4 tells us Esther finds out. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. Mordecai was not interested in any type of cover-up. He was seeking a cure. We have a lot of reasons to mourn in our world, and many are satisfied just to cover it up, just to put on a change of clothes and go on another day and act as if nothing had changed, that nothing had transpired. But Mordecai wasn't interested in a cover-up. He was seeking a cure. Esther was troubled because there's Mordecai in the king's gate. He's in sackcloth and ashes. She knows the ramifications if he were to enter into that gate in that state. And she's troubled. She's concerned. And she just wants him to go back to normal. At this point, Esther is unaware of what's taking place. It says in verse 5, then called Esther for Hatak. Hatak is this individual that we only find in Esther chapter 4. He's not one that is mourning, but he becomes a mediator. Lord willing, we'll touch back on these three things because I believe it's important for us to do so and apply it to things that are happening in our world and our lives this very day. But she calls for Hatak. This individual is going to be a mediator between Mordecai and Esther, as we'll see for the remainder of this chapter. And it's interesting that he comes on the scene, he's used just for this purpose, and then he's gone. But we'll come back to that. It says she called him one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend unto her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. What is going on? Why are you in this state of mind? Verse 6, so Hatak went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate, and Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him. He didn't hold anything back. He told it like it was, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also, he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther and to declare it unto her. So he doesn't just say, hey, this is what I heard, this is what's going around, this is speculation, this is the rumor. He says, this is what I know, this is what I've heard, and here's a copy, here's proof, here's hard evidence of what has happened. And he also gives her a charge, verse 8, that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him and to make request before him for her people. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. And Esther spake unto Hatak and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king, unto the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. She says, everybody knows that you can't just barge into the king. You just can't go in there demanding something. You've got to be invited. If you do, it could cost you your life unless the king grants you mercy for doing so. And she says, and besides, I haven't been called to the king in the last 30 days. Well, Hatak, Verse 12, it says, and they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai commanded to answer Esther. So there's this back and forth, and he says to her in verse 13, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape the king's house more than all the Jews. Just because you're in the king's house, you're not going to escape this. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther had them return Mordecai this answer, go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. This is interesting. And we see in this chapter Mordecai, Hatak, and Esther. Mordecai represents those who are mourning, those who are aware of grievous news, laws and decisions that are going to impact a people and bring them harm, possibly death and destruction. In this case, absolutely death and destruction. And he's mourning. And we have been called as believers to recognize this mourning. And as I said in Romans, to weep with those that weep and mourn with those that mourn. To be concerned not with just our own lives, but to be concerned with the lives of others. And Mordecai is concerned not just for himself, but for Esther and for all of his people. And so there he is in the king's gate, day after day after day, in sackcloth and ashes, weeping and wailing. And Esther finds out about it. And she's frustrated because this type of behavior is going to bring about backlash. It's going to cause trouble. But she's upset because she doesn't know all the details. She doesn't know all the facts. And I tell you, we are living in a day and an age where we need to know the details and we need to know the facts. News media is not what it once was. Social media is not a reliable source for information. It's very difficult to get all the facts. It's difficult to get the information. Most of the time, we hear about something, it gets thrown out there in front of all the world to see. People see it, make a rash judgment. Everyone's minds are made up. And maybe weeks, days, or longer, we get the rest of the facts, but it's too late at that point. People's minds are already made up, and the damage is already done. Esther hears about this. She sends clothes for him to put back on and to let life get back to the way it was. But he says, no cover up. We need a cure. And I submit to you tonight, there's a lot of things in the church. There's a lot of things in our lives. There are a lot of things in our world that doesn't need a cover up. They need a cure. They need immediate attention. And we don't need to just get dressed tomorrow and act like nothing has happened. We can learn this from Mordecai. But we also need to learn from Esther. We can't just afford to say, hey, just pick yourself up, get dressed, move on, get on with it. We need to understand what's happening in the lives, especially of those that mourn. And I just draw your attention to verse 5. She sent Hatak to him to know what it was and why it was. To not just know what happened, but to understand why it happened. What's really going on? She wants to get to the bottom of what's happening, and we need to do that. So she sends Hatak to be this mediator, to go back and forth, bringing this information. And I love this. Let's remember that God's providence is this central theme throughout this book. And we have a lot of examples in the scripture of people who seemingly are insignificant individuals. As I said, Hatak shows up in chapter 4. We see him 4 times in this chapter, and that's the end of it. We don't see him or hear of him anymore. There's a lot of examples like this. The little boy that Andrew finds that has a lunch that Jesus uses to feed the multitude. The men who let Paul down from the wall. The little Jewish slave that tells Naaman about a prophet in Israel. And we could go on and on and on about examples of people who just seem to be insignificant individuals. But they're not insignificant. Think about the ramifications of Hatak going back and forth with Esther and Mordecai, to Esther to Mordecai. These 2 individuals, one in the gate in sackcloth and ashes, the other unaware of what's going on, sheltered in her palace, not aware of the life-threatening situation and how important it is for someone to go back and forth between the 2 and relay factual, true, unexaggerated information. This world needs, I believe God desires, that you and I not just learn from Mordecai and mourn with those who mourn and weep with those who weep and understand what they're going through. But we need to be like Hatak. We need to be mediators. Men and women who speak the truth. Men and women who aren't showing partiality when it comes to judgment. We call it what it is. We don't exaggerate it, but we don't make little of it. We just speak the truth in love. This world needs individuals. God has been dealing with me about what's happening politically in our world, and he revealed to me that I had become a puppet to what I see on the news, or responding and reacting to those that I disagree with political views, and just being moved here and moved there, and being irrational and being emotional. God's been dealing with my heart, and I see the need here in this situation. And we have similar needs and situations in our world today. And we need men and women who will be level-headed, who won't allow emotion to eclipse reality, who will see things for what it is and call it what it is. And not playing team sports with situations or showing partiality among certain people, but will be fair and honest. And here's this individual going back and forth. And I just want to emphasize and ask you to consider the importance of this person's role in this situation. I've shared in the past that we are his workmanship. Paul says, that word poema in the Greek, God is writing a story. He's the author and finisher of our faith. And when we watch a show, a movie, some people are more in tune to details than others, and some people will catch a glimpse of something on the screen or a word that someone says. And they'll kind of say, hey, I kind of know what's happening here. I can see what's going to transpire as a result. Others are just oblivious. They don't pay attention to the details, and then they're shocked when something happens in the story. This individual, Hatak, he is listening to details. He's paying attention. And we need to keep in mind that not only is God writing a story with our lives, but he has us in the midst of other people's lives. We may be the main character in our story, but we're a part of the cast of characters in other individuals' stories. Hatak had his own life. He had his own issues. He had his own story, but now he finds himself caught in between Mordecai and Esther's story. And it was necessary for him to be a faithful messenger to mediate between the two. And we, as believers, should be men and women that can be trusted to pass information on between individuals. And unlike the little gossip game that we played as kids, where you tell something and they tell it and they tell it and they tell it, and by the time it gets all the way back, it's completely changed. It's a total different story. That should not be the case with us. We've been called to speak the truth in love. Well, Mordecai, verse 8, calls on Esther to make supplication unto him, the king, and to make request before him. So we have Mordecai in mourning. We have Hatak mediating between Mordecai and Esther. And now we have Esther being called on to minister. To minister. If we're going to be successful, if we're going to be involved in God working miracles in our world, in our lives, in the lives of people around us, we're going to have to learn to mourn. We're going to have to learn to see threats and problems and situations and not cover it up and just act like life is normal. We're also going to have to learn to mediate. We're going to have to learn to speak the truth in love, not exaggerating or making light of certain things in favor of this one or that one, or showing partiality in judgment, but to be a faithful messenger. And we're also going to have to learn that the Lord has us here to minister. And the very first thing that Esther is asked to do is to go before the king and make supplication and request. The greatest ministry that you and I could ever make for our world, for our nation, for our church, for our families, for our neighbors, for our leaders, is to make supplication before our king, to make request before our king. Our king is different than Ahasuerus, but we are called to minister before the Lord in prayer and supplication with requests and thanksgiving. And we need to recognize that in so doing, we can change the world. So he asked her to do so. And then in verses 10 and 11, Esther responds and he says, "You know this, Mordecai. I can't do this. I can't just barge in there. You need to understand that I can't do what you're asking me to do." And so Mordecai responds, verse 13. And the first thing he responds is this: "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews." We need to understand that we're not insulated from the things that are happening in the lives of other people. I've noticed this in our nation politically, that we're losing liberties along the way. We're losing freedoms along the way. But oftentimes, we'll see one group of individuals losing a freedom or not having what everyone else has, and we maybe unintentionally, but we have this attitude, maybe like Esther had, that, hey, look, this has nothing to do with me. This doesn't affect me. I don't want to be bothered with it. It will ultimately affect you. No man is an island. No man lives to himself. No man dies to himself. And Mordecai is reminding Esther of this. What happens to one people will eventually happen to all people. And he says, don't think that you're going to get away from this. And then he says this, verse 14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, and deliverance arise, and if you hold your peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. Mordecai was convinced God was going to act. God was going to fulfill his promise and his will. And it was up to Esther to either be a part of it or not. We mentioned this in our introduction, talking about God's providence. Many people, when they think about God's providence, they decide, okay, well, if God's already decided what he's going to do, and he's going to do what he's going to do anyway, I'll just be a passive observer, a passive audience. I'll just sit back and have the que sera, sera attitude. But understanding God's providence shouldn't drive us to be a passive audience, but an active participant. And that's what Esther's being challenged here by Mordecai. He's trying to get her to understand that, hey, this is going to impact you too. Don't think it won't. And besides that, God's going to work. He's going to move. He's going to act. He's going to accomplish something. With or without you. With or without you. We need to understand that when it's in our power to act, we need to act. The other day I was reading in my quiet time. I read through Proverbs and Psalms every day in my quiet time, and I want to read the verses that I read in Proverbs 24, verses 11 and 12. It applies to our study. He says this, if thou forbear to deliver them that are drawn unto death, and those that are ready to be slain, if thou sayest, behold, we knew it not, doth not he that pondereth the heart consider it? And he that keepeth thy soul, doth not he know it? And shall not he render to every man according to his works? I want to read that one more time. If thou forbear to deliver them that are drawn unto death, and those that are ready to be slain, if thou sayest, behold, we knew it not, doth not he that pondereth the heart consider it? And he that keepeth thy soul, doth not he know it? And shall not he render to every man according to his works? James says it like this in chapter 4, verse 17. For him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is a sin. And Mordecai is saying, God is going to move. God is going to act. God will work on behalf of his people. The question is, will you be a part of that deliverance or not? And that's a question that you and I need to contemplate today. God is moving. God is acting. God is working. Are we going to be a part of that? He says that it's going to come from another place if you don't. And then he says this, one of the most known verses in all the book of Esther. He says this. After he says, the deliverance will come from another place, and you and your father's house will be destroyed. He says, but who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? When we started our study of Esther, King Ahasuerus was already on the throne some 3 years. Then Esther comes on the scene 4 years after Vashti was removed from her position as queen. And now we're 5 years past that when Haman finally brings about his wicked plot. All these years have passed. All these things have happened. And Mordecai is saying, who knoweth whether or not thou art come into this kingdom for such a time as this? He says, Esther, you're in the right place at the right time. And this is God's doing. In Ephesians chapter 2, we're told that we're saved by grace through faith. It's not of ourselves, it's not of works, lest any man should boast. And then he says, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath ordained that we walk in. God has works. God has plans for our lives. They're already established. They're already laid out. They've already been written out. All we've got to do is walk it out, live it out. Here's the question for you and for me. For what reason am I in the kingdom at this time? Who around me is mourning? Who around me is weeping and wailing and wondering what's going to happen? What news am I privy to? What information do I know? Am I mediating where I can be a mediator? And am I ministering where I need to be ministering? God's writing a story. God's working his plan. His providence is going to take place. The question is, am I going to participate? Are you going to participate? Are we going to participate? And I just really think the Lord is challenging us with these questions tonight. Who around us are weeping? Who around us are wailing? Who around us are wondering? Who has God called us to right here, right now, to minister to? What has he called us to do? And will we make excuses? Will we say, hey, the risk is too high. Hey, I may fail. This or that may happen. I may be misunderstood. Or will we come to the conclusion that Esther did? As we close, I just want to draw your attention to the last part of verse 16, where Esther says this, I will go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. I wonder tonight, are we at that place in our ministry where Paul says in Romans that we present our body a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service? Where we, like Esther, if I perish, I perish. Where we, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, our God is able to deliver us. Our God will deliver us. But if he doesn't, if I perish, I perish. I don't want to be a passive audience. I don't want to sit by and be a spectator in what God is doing in these very days, at this very time in his providence. I want to be an active participant. I want to fulfill all that he has for me for such a time as this. And if I perish, I perish. I'm reminded of Paul when he was making his way to Rome, and first to go to Jerusalem, and different ones were understanding what was going to happen, and they were trying to stop Paul and talk him out of it. And he says, why do you do this to me? I'm ready. I'm ready to suffer whatever I might suffer to do that which God has ordained I do. If I perish, I perish. Can you hear the weeping? Can you hear the wailing? Can you sense the wondering? Are you willing to mediate, to get to the bottom of the what and the why? And more importantly, are you willing to minister, to rise to the occasion and do what it is that God has called you to do at such a time as this? I don't know what that is. But are you willing? And are you ready to say, if I perish, I perish? We're going to see God do the miraculous. And I believe He's the same God today. He's the same Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And I believe He desires to do things providentially in our world. He will do them, with or without us. My prayer today is that we won't be left behind. We'll be right in the thick of it, at the right place, at the right time. God bless you. Until the next time we pick up our study in chapter 5.